Blue lights cut through the darkness of an airport terminal half a world away from home. No warning. No negotiation. Just the sudden end of a run that was never supposed to end like this. For years, this man had stayed ahead, not by force, but by distance. While others took the risks on British roads and ports, he gave instructions from behind a screen. When police pressure tightened, he didn't fight it. He disappeared. And for a time, it worked. Thousands of miles from the UK, he lived openly enough to feel safe, training, socializing, even stepping into boxing rings under a different identity. But every message he'd sent, every load he'd ordered moved, every driver he'd trusted, was already being pieced together. Here's the question that matters. How does someone build a drug supply network worth tens of millions and still believe running will save them? In this video, you'll hear the inside story of how a large-scale UK drug operation actually functioned. How police followed the money, the phones, and the logistics. And how a man who thought he'd escaped the consequences was tracked down, arrested, and brought back to face the damage he left behind. One quick thing. If you don't subscribe, you only get fragments of these cases. You miss how the crimes actually worked, where the mistakes were made, and the moments that decided everything. Subscribe now, or the next story will be over before you understand why it mattered. Essex is often described as a commuter county, but for organized drug supply, it functions as something very different. It sits between ports and the capital. Major motorways slice through it. Freight moves constantly, day and night, toward London and back out again. For criminal groups moving drugs in bulk, Essex isn't just a place to sell, it's a place to move, store, and redirect at speed. That geography is why Essex has long been attractive to supply-level trafficking. Drugs don't need to stay there. They pass through it. Quietly. Quickly. Blended into normal traffic. By the time this story begins to take shape, the UK crime landscape is already changing. Encrypted phone platforms that once gave drug groups confidence are being compromised. Arrests follow. Networks collapse. But the idea that organized drug crime is finished doesn't last long. Instead of disappearing, groups adapt. The ones that survive move away from street dealing and visibility. They prioritize logistics over reputation. Fewer hands touching the product. More distance between the decision-maker and the risk. The power shifts upward, toward organizers. That's where Ben Ransome enters the picture. Ransome is in his 20s, based in Wickford, Essex, a town that doesn't stand out on a map. No ports. No glamour. Just close enough to everything that matters. To associates, he isn't known as a street dealer or an enforcer. He's known as someone who coordinates. Someone who arranges rather than appears. Little about his early life appears in public records, and that absence suggests a familiar path in modern organized crime. Not someone pulled in by chaos, but someone who learns early that distance is protection. Instead of selling, he connects sellers. Instead of carrying drugs, he controls movement. Instead of drawing attention, he avoids it. Whether through exposure, opportunity, or environment, Ransome appears to have entered drug supply at a level above the street, understanding that real power comes from managing people, routes, and timing. That kind of thinking doesn't develop overnight. It's built through observation, small successes, and the belief that staying unseen is the safest position of all. Police would later describe the network Ransome led as one of the largest they had investigated. But at this stage, there's no sudden explosion. No single moment where everything changes. What exists instead is structure taking shape. Connections being tested. Trust being established. Ben Ransome didn't arrive at drug supply by accident. By the time he began to matter, he was already thinking several steps ahead of the street. Instead of dealing directly, he positioned himself above it. Identifying people who needed supply, people who could move it, and people willing to take the risks he avoided. His early trajectory wasn't about speed or visibility. It was about coordination. Building trust with drivers. Testing reliability. Removing himself from anything that could be traced back quickly. That distance wasn't laziness, it was strategy. Ransome showed a clear preference for control without exposure. Phones became his main tool. Instructions were sent, loads were scheduled, and problems were solved remotely. Drivers and intermediaries handled collections and deliveries, while he stayed several layers removed from the product itself. If something went wrong, it wouldn't be his hands that were caught. As confidence grew, the operation expanded. Cocaine became a core commodity, high demand, high profit, constant movement. Ketamine followed, offering bulk sales with a different risk profile. Together, they formed the backbone of the supply network. What started within Essex began moving outward, into London, across the southeast, and beyond. With that expansion came scale. Loads increased in size. Routes became regular. Certain drivers were relied on repeatedly, not because they were expendable, but because they were trusted. Trust, in this world, is currency. And Ransome invested in it carefully. But the larger the operation grew, the harder it became to hide. More money meant more handling. More handling meant more exposure. Cash had to be counted, stored, moved, and paid out. Every transaction created a point of weakness, another place where mistakes could happen, where patterns could form. And patterns don't go unnoticed forever. Because growth creates noise. And noise attracts attention. Even as the network became more efficient, it was becoming more visible. Not on the streets, but on systems designed to notice repetition, volume, and movement. The very structure that allowed Ben Ransome to rise was also setting the conditions for what came next. By mid-2021, Ben Ransome's operation had moved beyond planning and into routine execution. This was no longer an idea being tested, it was a working supply network, running on schedules, trusted personnel, and repeat routes. The structure revolved around bulk movement, not street-level turnover. Drugs were handled in kilogram quantities, packaged for transport, and moved with the expectation that each journey carried hundreds of thousands of pounds in value. The mechanics were deliberate. Drugs were collected in bulk, stored temporarily, then redistributed through pre-arranged handovers. Vehicles were chosen for normality rather than speed or power, cars and vans that blended into everyday traffic. Drivers weren't improvising, they followed instructions. Pick-up points, drop-off locations, and timing were dictated remotely, reducing uncertainty and keeping decision-making in one place. Central to this phase of the operation were Ransome's couriers and lieutenants, people who physically carried the risk he avoided. Charles Charlie Lancaster, 42, was one of those trusted figures. He was observed collecting consignments directly connected to Ransome's Wickford base. In one key incident, surveillance teams followed Ransome as he walked to Wickford train station carrying a heavy bag. The transfer appeared brief and unremarkable. But when Lancaster's vehicle was stopped shortly afterward, officers recovered 9 kilograms of cocaine, tightly packaged and concealed. The weight alone placed the load close to a 7-figure street value. For investigators, it showed how directly Ransome could still involve himself when necessary. And how quickly that exposure could turn into evidence. Another major figure was Kieran Grant, 44, from Southend. Grant's role extended beyond single deliveries. He functioned as a high-volume courier, trusted with repeated movements of Class A drugs. On the 31st of March, 2022, when police stopped his vehicle on the M11, there was no attempt at denial. Officers found 19 kilograms of cocaine in the boot. Subsequent analysis of phone data and financial movement suggested Grant had been linked to the handling or transport of around £20 million worth of drugs in a single month, acting on instructions issued from above. As pressure increased, responsibility shifted to others within the network. Russell Dendle, 34, became increasingly active, particularly as Ransome began distancing himself from the UK. On the 20th of April, 2022, police stopped Dendle driving a blue Ford Focus associated with the operation. Inside, officers discovered 6 kilograms of cocaine. Evidence later showed that Dendle had taken on a managerial role, directing couriers, coordinating collections, and overseeing the movement of cash. Even as arrests mounted, the structure continued to function through delegation. The network also relied on storage points that appeared domestic and unremarkable. Ty Cook, 33, and his mother, Jane Cook, 53, were part of that infrastructure. On the 19th of May, 2022, police stopped Ty Cook driving a van in Westcliff. Officers recovered around 4 kilograms of cocaine from the vehicle. Searches of the family home revealed a further 7.5 kilograms of cocaine and 4.5 kilograms of ketamine, along with cash. The involvement of family members highlighted how the operation embedded itself into ordinary settings, places unlikely to raise suspicion until something went wrong. When investigators pulled the evidence together, the scale became clear. More than 200 kilograms of cocaine were linked to the conspiracy, alongside ketamine supplied on a similarly industrial scale. The estimated total value of the drugs involved reached around £20 million. These were not isolated seizures, they were fragments of a continuous supply chain that had been running for months. Communication sat at the center of everything. Ransome issued instructions through encrypted phones, regularly changing devices to reduce traceability. Messages were short, functional, and focused on logistics: where to go, when to arrive, what to collect, and who to contact. Drivers were paid well, sometimes over £1,000 a day, reinforcing loyalty and discouraging questions. Decisions were made remotely, allowing Ransome to stay physically removed from every seizure that followed. That distance defined his lifestyle during this period. While money moved and the operation expanded, Ransome reduced his physical presence. He didn't travel with loads. He didn't meet customers. He positioned himself as a controller rather than a participant, believing that separation would insulate him from consequences. But by early 2022, law enforcement pressure was mounting. Essex police began intercepting vehicles with increasing frequency. Drivers were arrested. Storage locations were uncovered. Each seizure weakened the network slightly, but it did not immediately collapse. For a time, the operation kept moving, adapting, reallocating roles, and continuing supply despite the losses. What police were dismantling wasn't a loose group of dealers reacting to opportunity. It was a structured distribution network with defined roles, trusted intermediaries, and a leader who believed control from a distance would keep him safe. That belief would soon be tested, and it would not hold. By the time the first major seizures hit the news, Essex police already understood they weren't dealing with isolated incidents. What appeared on the surface as routine traffic stops and vehicle searches was, underneath, a long-term surveillance operation aimed at identifying who was giving the orders. Officers began working backwards. Vehicles, routes, repetition, financial movement. Every arrest added structure to what had previously looked fragmented. Cash seizures were analyzed alongside phone data. Payments to drivers were mapped. Patterns emerged, not chaotic ones, but organized ones, repeating with discipline. Phone analysis became central. Encrypted devices recovered from couriers weren't useful on their own, but when combined, they told a story. Messages referenced the same decision-maker. The same timings. The same authority being deferred to. Drivers didn't negotiate. They waited for instructions. As arrests increased, so did cooperation. Some couriers talked. Others didn't need to. Their phones did it for them. Messages, when pieced together, pointed consistently to a single controller, someone who rarely moved drugs himself, rarely appeared on CCTV, but whose instructions sat behind almost every journey. While officers closed in, Ben Ransome was already adjusting. By early 2022, he understood the pressure wasn't temporary. Drivers were being stopped too often. Storage locations were being compromised. So instead of shutting the operation down, he made a different choice. By 2022, Ben Ransome had already accepted that staying in the UK was no longer an option. As drivers were arrested and seizures mounted, he left quietly, no farewell, no public trace. His route took him through Europe, moving between locations without settling, avoiding patterns long enough to stay ahead of immediate attention. But this wasn't a life he intended to keep temporary. Ransome eventually settled in Thailand, choosing a place that felt distant from the investigation unfolding back home. He based himself in Phuket, an area popular with expatriates, tourists, and combat sports gyms. There, he adopted a version of normal life. He trained regularly, socialized within gym circles, and immersed himself in boxing, a discipline that gave structure to his days and a sense of legitimacy to his presence. He didn't live like someone hiding in fear. Ransome entered boxing events under an alias, stepping into public venues, competing in front of crowds, and allowing himself to be photographed and filmed. To him, this was proof that the distance had worked. The arrests in the UK had happened. The network was gone. And he remained untouched. But the investigation never paused. Back in Britain, Essex police had completed the case. The evidence no longer depended on speculation or inference. Communications, financial records, and seized drugs all pointed to one controller. With domestic arrests concluded, the priority shifted outward. International inquiries were made. Intelligence was shared with overseas authorities. Ransome's location in Phuket was confirmed, not through chance, but through routine activity. Gym registrations. Fight promotions. His visibility, once a source of comfort, became the very thing that identified him. In 2024, Thai authorities moved to arrest him. Ransome was not caught fleeing or resisting. He was located and detained during a normal day. Officers arrested him in Phuket, placing him into custody without warning. From that point on, the process was formal and irreversible. Extradition proceedings began. British authorities submitted the case file. Thai courts approved the transfer. Ransome was escorted through airports not as a traveler, but as a detainee, his movements controlled, his destination decided for him. The final image is stark. An airport terminal. Security officers at either side. No phone. No messages to send. The man who once coordinated supply routes across the southeast of England was now being flown back under guard, his escape over, and his role reduced to a single position he could no longer avoid. Defendant. By the time Ben Ransome finally faced justice, the case against him was already built, not on speculation, but on years of conviction secured around him. The prosecution at Basildon Crown Court made it clear, Ransome was not a peripheral figure uncovered late in an investigation. He was identified early as the organizer sitting at the top of a wholesale supply network that moved cocaine and ketamine across the southeast of England. From 2021 onwards, detectives from Essex Police's Serious and Organised Crime Unit dismantled his operation piece by piece under Operation Spartan. Before Ransome was even located, his network had already collapsed in court. In May 2022, Charlie Lancaster was sentenced to 6 years after being stopped with 9 kilograms of cocaine collected directly from Ransome's home in Wickford. Ransome's fingerprints were found on the packaging. In January 2023, courier Kieran Grant received 8 years after being caught with 19 kilograms of cocaine on the M11. Investigators established he had moved or collected drugs worth £20 million in a single month, receiving weekly payments from Ransome. By April 2022, Russell Dental had stepped into an operational role after Ransome fled the UK. He was arrested with 6 kilograms of cocaine, and evidence showed he was directing couriers and handling cash on Ransome's behalf. He was later sentenced to 12 years. In May 2022, Ty Cook and his mother Jane Cook were arrested with over 11 kilograms of cocaine, for 0.5 kilograms of ketamine, and cash. Their sentences followed in January 2023, 6 years 9 months for Ty Cook, 3 years 9 months for Jane Cook. The court also heard how Ransome supplied David Glover, the principal drug supplier for an armed organised crime group linked to firearms trafficking across Essex. Glover was jailed for 23 years, as part of a wider prosecution that secured 85 years in prison sentences for that network alone. These convictions were not treated as isolated cases. Prosecutors showed how they formed a single chain: couriers, lieutenants, storage points, and customers, all traced back to Ransome. Phone data, surveillance, financial records, and seized drugs demonstrated central control exercised remotely. When Ransome was extradited from Thailand in July 2024, there was little left to contest. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply cocaine, conspiracy to supply ketamine, conspiracy to possess criminal property, supplying a Class A drug. At sentencing in December 2025, the prosecution described him as a leading figure in a highly organized supply chain, responsible for coordinating the movement of industrial quantities of drugs while deliberately distancing himself from the violence and weapons used by his customers. The judge accepted that assessment. Ransome was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Not as a courier, not as a middleman, but as the organizer whose decisions had already put dozens of others behind bars, and whose absence, flight, and eventual capture marked the final chapter of one of the largest connected drug investigations ever undertaken by Essex Police. When Ben Ransome was sentenced, the damage to his operation was already irreversible. The arrests and convictions that came before him had stripped the network of its drivers, coordinators, storage points, and cash handlers. With no couriers left to move product and no lieutenants to relay instructions, the supply routes he controlled across Essex and the southeast collapsed. What remained was evidence, seized assets, and prison sentences. The wider impact went beyond one organization. Operation Spartan disrupted a logistics-led model that relied on volume, speed, and distance rather than street-level visibility. Cash seizures, drug recoveries, and firearms taken off the streets weakened multiple connected crime groups that depended on ransom supply. The operation did not remove demand, but it broke a wholesale pipeline that had fed violence and organized crime across the region. Ransome's case also exposed how modern UK drug trafficking functions at scale. Control was exercised remotely, through encrypted devices and trusted intermediaries. Risk was pushed downward to couriers and handlers, while leadership stayed physically absent. Delegation replaced visibility. Distance was treated as protection. In the end, that structure failed for the same reason it was built. Everything led back to one organizer. Once the communication links were mapped and the money traced, distance stopped being safety and became evidence. Do you think running saved Ben Ransome time, or sealed his fate the moment he left? Tell me what you think in the comments. If you want more real UK crime stories, built from court records, police files, and verified reporting, subscribe, because the truth is always closer than it looks.